It has been 1 month since Syrian President Bashar al-Assad and his government were ousted, along with political power opposition forces, inheriting an economy simply devastated by 14 years of war. And joining us now to talk more about the Syrian economy after the fall of Bashar al-Assad, Omar Dahi, a professor of economics at Hampshire College and Director of Security in Context, a research network. Omar, welcome to the program. We certainly appreciate you taking time. This is something that is quick moving and very fascinating the way it's unfolding. Now, Syria obviously trying to emerge from a prolonged civil war and punishing economic sanctions really by every measurable entity. The equation just shows how far its economy has plunged. So what would you say, Omar, are the biggest challenges right now facing this transitional government?
Hi, Sean. Thank you for having me. The challenges are really steep, as you cited in the introduction. There are various estimates about the shrinking of GDP, but by 2023, between 70 and 80% from its 2010 value. And you can really see this in kind of World Bank reclassifying Syria from what was considered a solid lower middle income country to a lower income country over the past 14 years. So if you look at Human Development Index, which we think of as having income, health, and education, all three indicators have dropped significantly from particularly in health and education,
right,
were considered really significant values. So you have a shrinking of the economic base, you have a devastated infrastructure, a destruction of physical capital, of household stock, of housing stocks. There are macroeconomic challenges because basically the investment spending has been slashed over the past 14 years. The government prioritized the war effort, so redirected expenditure from investment spending to current spending. And that, coupled with the shock of the sanctions and the shocks from the war, has significantly basically marginalized the economic base. So you have a number of challenges. And what basically we see today is that most Syrians are in poverty. There are estimates that 80% of Syrians are unable to meet their basic needs of food, education, and health. And more than half of Syrians are in deep poverty, which is that they can't meet their basic food needs. So you have significant number of Syrians basically dependent on assistance on a daily basis. Of course, this doesn't also take into account the displacement, the millions of refugees. Putting all that together, there's really some steep challenges. And adding to that, as you mentioned, are, of course, the economic sanctions.
Yeah, let's talk more about these economic sanctions, because you talked about health and education, nutrition, poverty, starvation, things like that. What about these economic sanctions? What can be done to get more money in there quickly to help with such things as medicine aid and especially food?
Well, the sanctions are very complex. There's a labyrinth of sanctions against Syria. There's the UN Security Council sanctions, which in the UN system is considered sanctions, and they're what are called unilateral coercive measures, which are those imposed bilaterally rather than by the UN Security Council. And those are mainly imposed by the EU and the US.
Right.
And in my opinion, they've had a devastating impact on the Syrian economy. The EU sanctions hit Syria almost immediately because 80% of Syrian oil was exported to the European Union, and oil remained a significant part of the Syrian budget. Almost half the export revenues of Syria came from the export of oil, and 80% of that went to the EU. So that was a macroeconomic shock almost immediately in 2011 because the EU imposed, which is unprecedented, its entire range of sanctions within a period of a few months. US sanctions had less of an immediate impact because the US was not a major trading partner, but recently we've seen what was called the Caesar Act, which are secondary sanctions. So not just preventing US companies from dealing with Syria, but trying to punish third parties as well.
I'm sorry. I want to also talk about the role of women moving forward, trying to emerge from a decade and a half of civil war. Legions of women took to the streets recently to demand equal rights in the face of potential radical Islamic leadership and, of course, the aftermath of the Assad family's government.
Well, I mean, I think women have been essential and a key part of the uprising and of Syrian civil society. This is, since 2011 and prior to 2011. In terms of economic indicators. However, Syria has had a very low female labor participation in the labor market. It's one of, in the Middle East in general, it's one of the lowest in the world. I have to say that in the Syrian public sector, which is something that I think needs to be thought of in this moment when you think about moving forward, Syrian female kind of employment in the public sector, in the formal public sector, was significantly more than in the private public sector, So reducing the public sector, which is what the government now has in mind, because they said they're going to adopt a more free market, might have a disproportionate impact on women. In general, there is going to be a lot of issues, a range of issues, from economic to other priorities for women, as all Syrian families.
Yep.
But of course, among those are preserving their rights, both social, political, and economic.
Omar, I want to talk about infrastructure, because you talked about that and trying to emerge from this kind of fighting for a decade and a half. How difficult is it going to be? Because you talked about oil, and this is a country that used to produce 360,000 barrels of oil a day to sell, and now they're down to, what, 1 million barrels an entire month. So their coffers are quite bare right now.
Well, it's also, the oil is outside the control of the central government. Most of the most important oil wells are in the northeast of Syria, east of the Euphrates, which are under the control of the Syrian Democratic Forces that are allied with the US. So it's basically under the control of SDF and US, which that needs to stop. That needs to return ultimately through some sort of negotiation process to the central government, because that's badly needed revenue. Under the control of the Syrian government is the natural gas and kind of phosphates as extractive, possibly generating material. But the electric and power generation capacity has significantly deteriorated. And that's a major challenge moving forward. Restarting power generation, rehabilitating the power plants, and repairing the electric grid. All of that needs to happen, but at the very least, the declining but still available oil resources need to be returned to central government, in my opinion.
Yeah. Omar Dahi, can't thank you enough. Great insight, really complex situation, and clearly a very long way to go for that nation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.